everyone, and welcome. Hope you had a fabulous summer. This weather has been so amazing. We're here this evening with former Vermont State poet Sidney Lee with his new book, Now Look, a novel set against the background of remote northern Maine wilderness. Fishing, hunting, and the pleasures of the outdoor life bring together a mismatched pair of friends, weaving back and forth between the past and the present. Following Following the two friends, Ivy League educated George Mays, a drunk from his college days, and semi illiterate woodsman and logger Evan Butcher. Sidney will also be reading from his latest poetry collection, What Shines. He will be in conversation with fellow poet, longtime friend, and festival author committee member Tim Mayo. The chat is open and you can use the Q&A for author questions. Also, the event is captioned, and you can enable captioning on your Zoom screen. Sidney Lee served as Poet Laureate of Vermont from 2011 to 2015. A recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim, Rockefeller, and Fulbright Foundations, Lee founded and for 13 years edited the New England Review. Now retired after 43 years of college teaching, he is active in literacy and conservation efforts in northern New England. Lee has published 14 volumes of poetry, one collection, Pursuit of a Wound, was a finalist for the 2001 Pulitzer Prize. He has also published 2 novels, a selection of literary essays, and 5 collections of personal essays. He lives in Newbury, Vermont. Tim Mayo holds an ALB cum laude from Harvard University and an MFA from Bennington Writing Seminars. He has published 3 volumes of poetry, and his poems have been featured in multiple publications. Tim has been with the festival since 2003 and currently serves on the author committee. Welcome, Sidney and Tim.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sandra.
So, Sid, did you want to start with reading a selection of poems from What Shines?
That'll be fine. We can do that, and then maybe there'll be an interlude, and we can talk a little bit, and then I'll close with a short chapter from the new novel. All right.
Sure. All right, that sounds great.
The first poem is called 1949. Pinch me, I'm 81 years old, so there's a certain amount of long-term retrospection in this book. 1949, I was 7. In one, they pose, both grinning straight at the Kodak, an elm not yet blighted to death at their backs. It's years since either parent was on hand. How did it happen? I'm past 79. We live our lives, Psalm 90 says, as a tale that is told. From where I stand, that's all too real. What startles me is the fact that the tale is so short. An instant, it seems, from this moment back to its start. With what I've known, you'd think there'd be chapter on chapter. 5 children, all those grandsons, those granddaughters. And I could go on about each one, but on and on is no longer what it was. I have another photo on my dresser. My mother alone in that one, standing by water that sluggishly slides by our cabin in Sumneytown. I don't know how to explain why I can't be found in the shot. After all, the bucket at her feet is full of sunfish I've plucked from that very creek. Or is it? Like anyone else, I tell myself stories. Maybe my claim is no more than imaginary, which makes it, at least for me, not the least bit true. The fish are green and orange. Their lips are blue. I feel the heat that caroms off streamside boulders. I can whiff the swamp nearby where algae molder. Who dwells in our old house these days? Search me. Whose room was mine? Who recalls the ghost elm tree? The grass in the meadows likely gone brown as ever. No pumpkin seen in the pale, still gasps or quivers. Who visits the cabin? Who hooks small fish in the water? My mother stands there beaming beside my treasures. I shouldn't be, and yet somehow I'm stunned. Even the fish in that yellowed photo are young. we move ahead to about 1953, I think, when my parents bought what was then called a Wi-Fi, which was the latest wrinkle from the old Victrola that we had, and it seemed absolutely magical when we first played it. And this remembers it. Remembers that evening. It's called Hi-Fi. I think both little sisters were still too young for school. We brothers, not many years older. I suspect that what I say is more than a bit sentimental and may not have a basis in anything real back then. So be it. But let me keep it. The five of us hearing the tune, its strings and horns so alive. It's good to be where we are, near our parents' new hi-fi, which spills into every corner. The fidelity, almost shocking. They've told us about its wonders, and now at last they own one. Having adjusted some knob, they stand stone still for a moment, as if in a sort of trance. Of course, they're both long gone, so of course they no longer dance, cheeks touching or anyhow. But as long as I say so, they do. Indeed, the song I hear now is precisely cheek to cheek. Now, why would it talk about swimming in a river or a creek? Or maybe it's actually fishing. Who cares? Strange bliss pours forth as long as the record keeps spinning. Sickness, regret, and death will all arrive in time. And rancor, I won't forget the rancor. This evening, however, we brothers and sisters watch and chanted 5 children together on that couch with the fancy lace, while our faithful parents glide in what looks like a fond embrace. I didn't realize when I put these together they were great. This is the last that goes through a kind of a chronological process. We'll leap ahead immediately after the title poem of my book called What Shines. It's astonishing, this never-ending effort to have had a happy childhood. Why does it matter now? Why will yourself into all that forgetting? She may have been a good mother. At least she tried. Or did she? Once again, you're the one who's trying. You too contend that you remember moments that glow. You picture her standing one day in the snow, her teeth in a chatter, no doubt, and yet she looked quite cheerful. Or she seemed to be trying, as you are. The teeth, at least, were one good feature, radiant to the end. You were poised at the top of a hill on a flexible flyer, red sled that shone, your Christmas present at 9. It may have brought you joy. You're trying to alter the downslope rush to make it shiny too, to blot out the icicles of snot, the raw fingers, chilblain, pain. A father was there, a good man, you're quite sure, who's now no more than a specter, whose presence is no more advantageous than on that day. Or was it of some avail? You can't remember. You honestly can't remember. Perhaps you just don't want to. You're doing well. At least you're trying. With this, your obstinate bid to sweep off misfortune, to see if there's anything more than only sorrow. Well, there were certain instants. You say, I remember stones. You say, I saw a beach by moonlight. And did those pebbles glint like stars, as you insist? You yearn to be sure. Clouds never came to eclipse them. You keep on trying. There's that pervasive gleam along the shore. Then you take a step, and suddenly there's nothing. This is called Politics 2020, and it was written in that year, a fraught year politically. And as we're all aware, it hasn't gotten any less fraught since. I don't directly address the phenomenon of the fat traitor, but he was there. He was there in the background of this poem. Politics, 2020. A long-haired cat in my rearview mirror, flat on the tarmac, was it racing for a freedom it would never know? Did it flee a coddled life? Not much I passed would suggest as much. Double wides, two with Dixie flags, pastel-sided like cheap Florida motels, appear somehow to glare at one another across a minuscule yard full of kids' toys. Everything's muddied by rain. This latest shower darkens the coats of three ribby ponies. I wonder, do they ever get ridden? They vacantly gaze over paddock wire, but at a distance. They have their reasons. Yellow insulators suffice to remind them electric shock will greet a touch. They all seem well beyond any penchant to fight their fate. The eyes of a tethered pit bull glitter. He'd like to get at them. Now I cruise through town. The dead axe factory, the empty storefronts, Dollar General. For some reason, a few men shriek at a sopping few on the opposite sidewalk. One man who doesn't look lame keeps shaking a cane. I don't know a thing. I keep going. I'm a lucky man. I get along with most people I know who get along with most they know. Some of us have treasured friendships for ages. Feigning unconcern, though why would those strangers care about me? I sing along with country tunes on a radio station. So easy to harmonize. The same three chords, every song. Another reminiscence from my checkered childhood. This is called My Mother's Bed Jacket. Its color soothed me. It might have been called, if not quite rightly, rosy. Nothing has matched it since I was small. The fabric must have been something like velvet. It felt more than merely soft. Since those days, in fact, I've touched nothing like it. The pillow she used in unsettling darkness as she lay by her gentle husband shared the smell of that supple garment. Was its fragrance artificial, or rather the scent of a lovely young woman before years and liquor conspired to take her? It seems I still ache for that old aroma. It hasn't been replicated. It will never be. How did I ever climb over the four posters' rails, or did she lift me? I hope she lifted me. I've resolved the sorrowful rage that eddied between us for too long a time. I forgive her. After all, I had a part in every storm. With a coarsened will for decades, well after that father died and left me broken, I fought to turn my mother back to what she could be no more. I cursed her stomach-churning breath as I hold her up from the floor. As I tried to scream away her roughness, to shout her red face back to pink, all futile, given her whiskey deafness. But still this longing, however faint, to climb and lay me down near that nameless hue and odor and scent. Two more. This one is called Suspension. I bought a cabin in a very remote part of Maine for $500 in 1967. And I haven't missed any season there ever since. It's been quite a while. This is called Suspension. Season of the strawberry moon, the Algonquins call it. The berries ripen in June. We see them along with what's left of ancient toad roads. Some say rose moon, some say hot. We won't be, but if we were forced to forage, those shy red bubbles wouldn't start to stifle our hunger. If solitude can be shared, we share it here, in our cabin, deep in the woods. Don't ask where it is. There are gullible perch in the lake, under damp duff in the forest, small worms for bait. We own a stable rowboat. Rain dripped all day from the eaves, then blue broke through exactly on time for Moon to delete it. Our crackly portable radio says, fair tomorrow, hot but pleasant, more good fortune. What did we do to deserve this? In the jagged row at our clearing's edge, wild roses glow like gemstones splayed on felt. Mere minutes before the darkness yields to moonlight too, and they go wan. A damselfly kept drying its wings in late afternoon on a wall beneath the eaves. It lifted just at dusk to hover briefly over its tiny world, as we do over ours. Last one I'll read for now. It's called Compensation. The Apple Pickers. My grandmother, in whose house I and my four siblings and my father and mother lived, it was her house. She'd been born in it. My mother was born in it, and she was an amateur painter, and she was not a very good painter at all. But she produced one masterpiece in all the many, many years that she lived. She lived to be 98 years old. And this poem remembers that picture and a number of other things. So, Compensation, the Apple Pickers. As ever, she steadied the paper with her left hand, the right one wielding a nub of charcoal. This time, she worked on a sketch for what would become her painting of 11th hour apple pickers. No, frost on grass, ghost white, fragile as silence, against which her fingers would be stationed, the pillow of leaves below the tree, umber gray. Subtle shades she rightly considered a challenge. Everything challenged her, because, and she likely knew it, the rude fact was she painted poorly. And thus her grandchildren all believed it a marvel, after the sketch gave way to canvas and oils, that the picture proved brilliant, as if it were crossed by magic. It implied unseen things, for instance, crows, which showed nowhere in what she produced, but they could still be heard nearby and raucous outside the frame. And we caught the scent of windfall fruit, or rather I did, as I never told my siblings for fear of being taunted. All of us loved her, and we laughed at her too. We'd spy on her as she studied the easel on her sun porch, biting her lip, shaking her head, then dabbing again at the palette, lost in thought, no doubt. May our laughter be forgiven. We were ignorant, not callous. Like her, if only once in our lifetimes. May we be blessed by something that transports us beyond mere chronological measure, as she was by her one good painting, which compensated her for ongoing griefs, losing a son to the flu epidemic, and then soon after losing her husband. The Apple Pickers seems to have been her stingy muse's gift, not just for her valor, but for her persistence, for simply putting in time. So I will stop there for now, Tim.
Oh, thank you. I did want to ask you if you would read one poem that I found sort of, well, as an ars poetica, shall we say, and that's your poem entitled Fall,
Oh, wait a minute.
page 74.
If anything, it's sort of an anti-ars poetica.
Well, fair enough. Okay. We can argue about that. Okay.
Well, I'm sure there are poets in the audience, and some days you say, well, what the hell? Let's go do something more useful. At any rate, this is called Fall. I make myself ignore the limb-perched osprey and the mink that nimbly slithers across its stream. They're commonplace, routine. I'll focus instead on October red in that maple. Well, what's red after all? Is it crimson, cochineal, scarlet, carmine? Is it R at the very western reach of the spectrum, most distant kin of this overhead V? Maybe something like bloodshed or ruby? The color remains beyond my capacity to depict, like a being immense, transcendent. I won't argue about its existence. Choiceless, I'll affirm, at least for the moment, the inescapable hopelessness of all I might seek to address. For now, let that insufficiency be blessed. The fall will take all this away. I mean, all that all might be. There's no need for me to talk out my reveries. I think, observe, revere, adore. Poetry, vexing sure, feels as naked as next month's trees.
So you think of this as an anti-ars poetica?
Well, no, not that. That was badly put. It's
Okay.
an expression of what I just suggested may be a commonplace experience where you've done a certain amount of writing, and I've been blessed to urge with the urge to write pretty constantly. But every so often, I think, what Confucius said: "Get up, old man, and do something useful." And I think this may have reflected an interlude like that. In fact, it did. I remember it very clearly. As soon as I finish this, I'm going to go out and take a hike.
Uh-huh. All right. Well, I love the idea of trying to express red and how inexpressible it really is, um, and what that can stand for metaphorically.
Well, I think it stands for everything I just said. That uh, writing poems is, for me, it's a great pleasure. I would have quit years and years ago, but it's hard. You know that, Tim. It's hard to do it, and half the time, more than half the time, 85% of the time, you sit down to do something and it doesn't amount to anything. It goes into what I call my boneyard. A failed attempt, and throw it into this cardboard box, and then maybe you want to write a book of essays and you dig it out and turn it into prose, which is really what I did with my last collection of uh, personal essays. So that's all it was. It's not a chronic condition. I keep scribbling. Nobody seems able to stop me.
Wow. Uh, for me, your poetry always, uh, seems to have like a scaffolding of, you're somebody who loves nature so much and it's so important to you and has been for so long in your life, uh, that I always think of nature when I think of your poetry, even though a lot of the poems that you read today really are not, taking place in the natural world, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But I think of Here, for example, that your last collection of poems, where I felt that there were so many that moved me. Of that you wrote about the snowshoeing, all sorts of different uh, experiences in nature. Um, and how do you feel that it works in your poetry? Do you want to talk about that a moment?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've been a pretty avid outdoorsy guy virtually all my life. So it's quite, and I live out in the corner here, and even farther out in the corner when we go up the Main. So it's perfectly natural that I should use a natural context as my poem's context. Now, I try and shy away from what I think too many people do, which is to regard nature as a great storehouse for metaphors, and you just go
Oh,
cherry pick them and put them in. I think, my friend, the late and wonderful Stephen Dunn, we remained friends even though he beat me for the Pulitzer that year. He's
uh,
such a good poet, but he had a sycamore growing at the top of one of the Rocky Mountains, and that just took all the credibility out of that particular uh,
uh,
poem. I think if you're going to incorporate nature, you ought to be pretty sure that what you're talking about is accurate. Um, but I think I don't know if more serious is what I mean, but at all events, I have never understood the impulse to obscurantism in poetry. I've My reverence for Frost has to do with the fact that one almost always knows where he or she physically is in a poem of his,
Yeah.
uh, and that's the way to me of inviting the reader in. And you know, uh, Ezra Pound is a complicated poet. Pound is a very, I mean, Frost is a very complex poet. There's a big difference. Uh, but you can take Frost's poetry almost anywhere, and somebody will get something out of it. One doesn't feel immediately excluded or that she has to learn a special language in order to penetrate it. And I think, in large measure, though not altogether consciously, certainly not every time I sit down do I think this, but I think in some measure I started uh, writing, letting the outdoors into my poetry, partly because I spent so much time in it, and partly by way of providing a context that would the reader, whether he or she was accustomed to the topography and weather of northern New England or not, could at least understand what was being talked about on a physiological level. I mean, I think of poetry as being kind of small dramatic units. And if you if you talk about a poem as being moving, it's almost a physical thing. I started here and then I took you to another place, and and the natural backdrop enables me to do that. I hope at my best, at any rate.
You've also talked about how you feel about sort of the idea of discovery in poetry. Do you want to mention a little bit about that? How you
Yeah, I mean, I haven't I haven't persisted in being a poet for all the money and fame. Uh, what really intrigues me about it is I think it's a vehicle for discovering what I didn't know was on my mind, and for finding odd connections. Starting out, I never know where I'm going when I begin with a poem, and if I do, it's pretty apt to be a bad poem. I mean, there won't be any of that excitement of discovery. What was it Frost said? No tears in the writer, none in the reader. Uh, as I go along, all of a sudden, by abandoning myself to the materials, to the language, I just operate on the faith that if I pay close attention to those words that keep coming for one reason or another, they will lead me in the direction of what we kind of reductively call meaning. And I love that. I love all of a sudden, getting to the end of a draft and saying, "Gee, I didn't know I was going to write about that. I thought I was going to write. I didn't know I was going to write about Y. I thought I was going to write about X." Uh, and that to me, uh, that's the substitute for money and fame. That's what keeps me going. It also provides some modicum of order in a life which is otherwise certainly absent my wife, not altogether orderly.
tell me now how do you find, you've written what, two novels now, is that right?
That's
And
right.
Now Look is your second novel.
Hmm.
And how is let's say, an active discovery, or that must be a lot different because you have a continuous piece that is a novel that is not made up of, collection of poems, which
Right.
were instances at
Well,
different times. Yeah.
it's an entirely different feeling. I mean, it's one thing that's kind of nice about it is you come back to it every day and there's something there other than mere blankness that you have to confront. Uh, but there is some similarity in the sense that I incorporated all kinds of things into the both of those novels that I never knew would belong there. I mean, in the first one, that one was all set up in the same part of Maine, but at one point the protagonist finds himself in Chartres, uh, and and a terrible a terrible tragedy. I won't go into the one I mean within the book. Uh, Actually happened when I lived in New Hampshire to a friend of mine, a couple of children who died, and I incorporated that and put it into the narrative. I didn't see that coming, but it's interesting that the first novel that I wrote way back in 1980, or published way back in 1989. That began as an essay. I was going to write. There was a wonderful old raconteur in our part of Maine. He'd been a railroad tie maker. He made railroad ties with an axe, a very hazardous thing to do. And he was an absolutely gifted raconteur. You could have put him on the stage at Carnegie Hall and he'd never have blinked. And I wanted to write down almost a prose transcription of the story he told me once. And not one of his better ones, but one that somehow lodged in my mind. And 300 pages later, I found out that I had written a novel. And I found that people say, how do you choose whether you're going to write an essay or a poem or a short story, which is my least prolific genre, or a novel? And this sounds, I don't like to sound billowy or mystical, but it almost feels like the form chooses me. Oh, I see what's happening. That's what happened with I've got 7 books of personal essays now, and all of them began as translations of failed poems. And it occurred to me, well, maybe in a more supple prose format, I can make this thing, whatever it is, do what it's meant to do. And when I first discovered that approach with a book I published in 1994 called Hunting the Whole Way Home, and I started out by writing by that act of translation, then all of a sudden everything I saw wanted to be an essay. It didn't want to be a poem. And the reason I started doing it to begin with is that I had written a second novel, which I thought was going to be my breakaway novel, but I was wrong. Nobody liked it at all. And I was deeply depressed by that. And I had not so long before I had published a book of poems, so I said I didn't want to start in on that again. So I started this essay thing, and I do love that format. I love the openness of it, the open-endedness of it, the free associativeness of it, which is, I think, for me at any rate, even more pronounced than it is in lyric. So, as I say, the genre seems to decide for me what it's going to be.
So, do you want to speak a little bit more about Now Look before you begin to read?
I will. I can read the jacket blurb. I think Sandy already did. It involves 2 characters. My friend Bill Matthews was once asked after a poetry reading in New York, and he came up and said, I really like that. Are those real poems or did you make them up? Well, people have been asking me since this novel came out, how autobiographical is it? Is it real or did I make it up? Well, the answer is both, of course. It's a hard enough question to understand, let alone answer. But it has these 2 characters. One is a young, fancily educated man who succumbs early to alcohol, but and that develops in one way, and then and an old man from our section of Maine, as I vainly call it, whom I loved and knew very well. He had been a river driver, one of these men that stood on logs and rode them 39 days down to the ocean from that part of Maine. And he was also a fabulous storyteller, much more terse than the other one. So a lot of that older character is based on him, but he's a composite figure as well. But after I published that one way back in the late 80s, I decided, and then the second one kind of disappeared into the ether. I decided I wanted to write a kind of a sequel. It's not an exact sequel except geographically. And I started it in 1997. And I kept approaching it and avoiding it, and approaching it and avoiding it, and approaching it and avoiding it. And the only upside of COVID for me was that I said, well, here I am, at least semi-sequestered. It's time to do this damn novel or forget about it. So I sat down, and that's all I did for 2020 and half of 2021. And that was so. It was published 35 years after the first one. The first was published by Scribner, so of course everybody who was connected with that place when I did that first novel was gone, mostly fired by the bean counters. And but I did get in touch with somebody there, and she said, "Well, if your book got horror in it." I said, well, yes, but I don't think it's the kind you're thinking about. So how about fantasy? Ditto, but I don't think it's the kind you're thinking about. Is it a young adult novel? And I said, no. And the conversation came to a thudding halt. So this book was published by Globe Pequot Down East Books in Maine, appropriately enough. They're part of a big consortium, and they've treated me very, very well. And I'm kind of happy that it's published by a Maine publisher. Now, this short chapter I'm going to read, it's not told from the point of view of either of those main characters I mentioned, because I couldn't find any that would stand alone that were short enough. This particular chapter is told from the point of view of the older man's wife, also modeled on someone whom I admired greatly and knew well. And it gives you some insight into what the situation is for both the younger man and the older man. Her name is Maddie. Maddie scowled through her bedroom window, following George Mays as he walked out the dooryard to the Tannery Bridge. Then the river alders hit him. On the way to his camp, ready to head down country, was he? Nowadays, she and George didn't talk like they used to. But who towed her husband's sorry carcass home now? It was coming on daylight in their back lot, covered with maple whips now, with some with a touch of flame already. Lord, she used to love the time between tree color and snowfall. Only that little bit of red in the woods to start. But then the wind's coming back soon, stiff enough to lay foam lines side by side on McLean Lake, and the salmon and brook trout moving to the shallows come early October. When she was a girl, she used to stand on the bridge and drop pebbles just to watch them shoot out and then slide back where they'd been. She felt a change brewing even now, no matter the weather stayed warm. Two ravens were fighting a blow to get upstream, gathering 2 yards and giving up one, flopping around like laundry. She could just make them out against the gray. The mountain ash berries in her dooryard weren't even ripe yet, but the waxwings were mobbing them already. Oh, the light off those birds. You don't have to live with that old man, she whispered after George. Well, time was, she thought, of Evan as a hero too. That short year they were courting, when weather meant a thing or two. Like she was just thinking, buck deer and rut, say, in the town all women in daytime. The best looking young fellow in the village, Evan. No two ways about it. He'd get done in the woods, working or hunting, whichever, and he'd be back from camp on Saturday evenings so as to go out somewhere only with her, a dance maybe, or only a moonlight canoe ride up lake. Then they had all day Sunday. Nobody but the two of them until Tommy was born. Evan turned himself out so nice in those days. He used to wonder how on earth he could get his shirt so white, and who made it that way. You could see it even after dark, nearly the same for his teeth. He had every one of them then. Never mind, he'd chewed that awful snooze like any lumberjack. And under the shirt, it'd make a horse to eat her own bedding, she muttered. Then she blushed, even though she was all by herself. It wasn't just how Evan looked, though. He was a man among men. Drove the Percy every April. First one hired by the time he was only 19. Best paid with Biscuit the cook, who was on the drive since Evan was a baby. That river business scared Matty half to death before he quit, praise Jesus. They don't drive timber by water anymore. Winters he cut railroad sleepers. Ties, the company called them. Camp boss would go man to man at night, taking tally. 14, one of the boys would say, and it stayed about like that for everybody up to Evan. 20, 24, 26. even 32 once after he heard Sebby Pearson meant to beat him. Evan worked himself about off his feet, and Sebby went right back to the pack. Went right back to the pack because her husband cut 32, and each last one an ace sleeper, which Boston and Maine would be glad to lay down. Even in his prime, he couldn't do such a thing now. Not enough good wood anymore. In those days, plenty of fine trees stood handy by, south of Gray Pond and the Black Swamp. That meant Evan with home nights. It was sure a lot better than during the drives in spring. When she learned what lonesome meant, and she couldn't sleep for the thought of him trotting around on those damn long logs or stepping out on a jam with a charge of dynamite on a pole. How could a man claim to love such a business? But Evan claimed he did. Those days making railroad sleepers, he never saw their house in daylight, but for Sunday and winter. He went off every day with a lantern and that broadaxe and a dinner pail and bucksaw strung on him somehow, and he wouldn't come home till after dark. She got up with him and waited for him nights. Plenty to do anyhow, especially after Tommy came along. But that didn't make any difference. Evan, when she was tending the baby or stoking the furnace or splitting kindling, a lot of what she did was wait for Evan Butcher. Now look. Maddie felt all slept out early as it was. Plenty of memories to bear down, mostly one or three most like it. She always tried her best to put the kids out of her mind, but it wasn't ever really all that way. And there Evan was, out in the shop so drunk he didn't know he was in the world. She stepped into a set of his drawers. He was skinny now, and Maddie had gone a little to girth, which she didn't care a particle about. Then an old shirt, also his, not white. She trotted downstairs. The way to keep going, her mother always told her, was keep going. She knew what she was talking about, too. Shingled her own roof as an old woman, and it never leaked the glass full, even though she moved away the very next year. Old? Was that what Maddie just thought? 65 was what her ma was when she did the job. Old? Then her ma left Woodstown. She had a little pension from the army because Maddie's father got himself killed in the first war. Maddie never knew him, but her husband's money was just enough for Ma to get herself out of town, forevermore bullheaded. It can't be healthy if it's good weather every day and never different, she told Ma that. But look what happened. A few years went by and then it started, just a little bunch in one armpit at first. Maddie always wanted to be like her mother, but to add on a quarter century or so. Now she was 78 and on her way because her mother was only 72 when she passed. 78. How'd that happen so quickly? Maddie meant to keep the same gumption Ma had, but she wanted to live to around 100. Why not? Well, why, considering? There was a time she pitied her poor mother, living those years without a man. But any way you sliced it, if he woke up sober enough to talk a full sentence, her own man would tell the world to this day that a person could play checkers on his wife's shirt tails. She never stood still. Well, that's Maddie Butcher, she thought, and it'll keep on being Maddie Butcher. Couldn't change if she cared to, and she doesn't. She stood in the kitchen a while till she caught herself studying the electric tea kettle, that drooling bastard. There showed a crack in the spout, and you almost lost one cup for one you boiled. She meant to find herself a new pot because Evan wouldn't get around to fixing things the way he was. Wouldn't even drink coffee now. Too busy drinking from another cup. Plug-in kettle, gas stove, oil furnace. Lord God, all kinds of things changed, some for the better. They kept the wood stove, nice to fire up now and again come fall, taking a little chill off, saving on the oil, but not for old times' sake. Old times was splitting off cedar chips on the kindling floor first thing when you got up if you forgot or were too played out to do it the night before. One of Evan's sportsmen told her it was called killing floor down south, which was a better name, especially if you had the morning sickness. Get the stove hat and then lay in a few sticks of whatever hardwood there might be to hand. Took half an hour on a good morning before you'd feel halfway comfortable. She hooked up the drooler and found the tea bag. Then she grabbed her molasses. People could say there was nothing to it, but she always felt healthier for the blackstrap. Let them think whatever they wanted. She never put much else inside her in the morning these days. Evan was out in the shed, which she'd burn up if she dared, lying on that awful bedroll, or maybe just in his clothes on top of the cot. She hadn't been inside the shop a dozen times after they left it. It was what they had for a house, clean through the second year they were married. That was plenty. Nowadays, she could barely put her eyes on the little building for the memory of cold, a foot of snow by Thanksgiving, Evan in the woods. And there she was, bare-knuckled in the dooryard, putting in studs and joists and stringers, fitting those two little windows old man Patcher gave them for the wedding. By and by was nailing the waney boards on the upright, all they could afford. She might look at the shack easier if Evan would just yank those ratty old wains and put on some clapboard or even budded planks. That wasn't going to happen, so she chose another window to look out. She wiggled her fingers to thaw the memory of one of those mornings. She thinks how she suddenly felt something down below once, and when she got indoors, come to find out the sweat of her backside froze her cheeks together. She had to dip her hands in a water pail to tend to herself. Good old days? Pretty likely. It was nicer looking out the south side anyhow, over to Addie Benson's house, which Addie kept up nice even after Thump died, and then past her to the side hill. It still showed signs of a burn, Lord, 35 years since. The popple took over after, white as birch in winter, than the lovely yellow leaves in spring, which looked like riffles in a brook when the wind fluttered them in summer. Money trees, some called them, not because it was worth much, but when those leaves came down in October, they looked like coins on the ground. That hill was most of it gone to cabbage pine by now and red maple suckers in the clear spots. Popple doesn't live long. A lot of them fell down and rotted a few years back. That old shop could fall and rot too, and Maddie wouldn't care no more than if she stepped on a pissamire. It was a start for them once, but good riddance after they got the big place up. A lot of better years in the big house, which she and Evan still call it. A lot of very good years, truth be known. Woodstown lost its best river fishing by the late 60s, but it got a reputation by and by for bass in the lakes, and when they paved the roads to just 10 miles from town, Evan could make $1 off rich folks, taking them out to fish and looking after a couple of their summer places. The sports were the real money trees, seemed like. You had to just tolerate a few mucky mucks, but there was a decent one or two, even that foolish George Mays, and she'd admit it. George meant well. Why couldn't he save Evan, though? Save her while he was at it. Save something, for Christ's sake. Now, who was the foolish one? Guiding was a fine thing by her and Evan both, and every inch he stood off from a falling tree or a floating log, that was a good inch, as far as she was concerned. And not just on account of the danger. When he guided, they spent some time together like married ones ought. That didn't last forever, though, did it? What in creation did? Some good in the old days after all. Look what's going on now. The teapot spat on the oilcloth. That kind didn't whistle a note, which was a nuisance. That's why she burned that hole in it, so she shouldn't complain. Her own fault. Could have burned the whole house down. She yanked the plug and filled the cup with the cub bears looking down from a tree. The picture of the trunk wore off a long time back, so the bears seemed like they were flying. Angel bears. There was a little gray wad of something under them, which Evan used to patch a seat. She plain forced him to do that, because she wasn't giving that cup up, not for her life. Tommy made it for her when he was 11 or such a matter a lifetime ago. He worked it out of a little jar of clay she gave him. Evan's patch job weren't much account, but it seemed like he didn't care about that or anything else these days. There'd be no more cups and no more Tommies right from when the doctors had to cut him out of her. No more Tommies even if they didn't. No more babies at all. Not in this godforsaken house. She rode all the way to Centerville to get that big cut made. It was in an A model Ford older than God, but was the only rig in town that would make the trip. Evan kept crying behind her from the rumble seat, just like a baby himself, till she almost went half deaf with it, as if she didn't have enough to put up with. It was more than a full day and night of labor before she even got into that Ford. Mr. Patcher owned the car, and he kept right on rolling, never a word, hell bent. He was a fine old rascal, good family, all those Patchers. 40-odd miles of bad road with frost heaves and her bottom about blowing out. Then came the ether, which smelled like death itself, even next day. They dropped that cloth down over her face, and quick as that, she saw a bunch of lumberjacks rising up into the air, and not one face could she recognize. The next thing, the clothes all fell off, and there were nothing but skeletons underneath. Their bones were all blue. Her mother kept shouting about the mess from the far side of the river and claiming she was dead too. That didn't make any sense. Ma wouldn't die for years, but she hardly knew her grandson. It was going to Florida killed her. Mattie would swear it. Nobody used to do that around here, but different ones made that same mistake these days if they could afford it. It didn't last down there either. Always some son or daughter taking a bus and driving them back up home in the dear departed's car, which they traded quick as they could along with their own for a better. Well, that was some trip to get Tommy born, the first on her side at Evans, not delivered in their parents' house. But they just couldn't get him out at home. If Mattie ended up in hell, she thought that day she'd be ready. She still thought so, even if what she had right here was not the bed of roses people sing about either. That George Mays, he was a grown man himself with his own past, but he didn't know from Toby's ass what it was for her to be with the old man now he worshipped. She never held much against the boy. She still couldn't help calling him a boy. But no, he didn't understand, did he? Oh, Evan drank all his life. Which of those men didn't? Only the ones with the sugar or whatever. The rest liked to sip, and then some in a few cases. Not too much you can do if that's what they're after. A woman looked out for herself because there wasn't anyone else going to be doing it. Mattie filled the bear cup again, spooned in some more molasses, then some carnation. She watched the milk cloud up before she stirred. Then for some reason, she got thinking about young Wilma Whitten, next house past Eddie's. Wilma came in 2 winters back, not so long after that business with Tommy's kids. She was small as 20 seconds, but here she stood with a big shiner on her like a prize fighter. Alan, again. Mattie, I can't figure out what to do, Wilma told her. Do? Mattie asked, though she knew plain as day what was meant here. He'll come in cocked and smack me or yank my hair and rip me right over in the chair at supper time and that like. I'd put the boots to him. Wilma stuck her hand over her mouth like somebody covering up bad teeth. A man in that shape couldn't whip nobody, Mattie told her. Yes, a woman has to tend to herself. I will wait till time was right and I'd tip him over by the Jesus. Wilma looked white as a ghost. She couldn't say a mumbling word. Tip him over and give him the boot as soon as he lights. She didn't have much faith in Wilma. Next day but one, though, here's Alan going around town with shiners in both eyes, talking about running his skidder and up on a stump in the burnt land. Hadn't raised a hand to Wilma since. Mattie smiled. Oh, he still cursed and howled, but never the hand. No, it didn't mean all peaches and cream for Wilma, but she took a step to the front all right. Would Mattie give her the same advice today, or was she only madder than a hornet that with all that went on? Maybe she just wanted to punch the bejesus out of something, give God himself a licking. But that was still good advice she handed Wilma. It was lucky for Alan he never married Mattie, nor that she'd have him. Black eyes wouldn't be a patch on the trouble then. You could say this much for Evan anyhow. He never even grabbed her. And that wasn't just because he knew she weren't one for taking things exactly like a lady. He did know that, but bullying wasn't in one of the butchers, drunk or sober, no matter what that wife of Tommy's claimed. It'd be strange to some, but no, the hardest part was just how Evan quit telling stories 3 or 4 years gone, maybe more. She was still surprised to miss them so much because she'd heard every last river tale in the world 100 times. It was only that he told some corkers. One about Eddie and Nora Sullivan was her favorite. Come April, the Sullivans set up what they called a store about halfway downriver. A lot of work to get stuff in there overland, but the river drivers always felt ready for something beside beans and cream of tartar biscuits by the time they reached there. The Sullivans sold corn, venison, or beef, maybe some chocolate, tobacco, or that beeswax goop for blisters. Not much else, but they got a nice take. All IOUs, of course. Nobody was going anywhere, though. They'd call in their cash once the crew finished the drive, except every few years, the poor one that didn't make it. Mattie could still shake, just remembering how she fretted. And they'd keep that little place open right through deer hunters. But what little custom they got way out there where it was, she didn't know why. Evan told about how the storekeepers took in an orphan bear a trapper brought them one spring, not much bigger than a house cat. Eddie wasn't too particular about it, but Nora was soft-hearted, like women are. At least that's what Evan said. So they raised this cub up till he got big enough to go back in the woods, which he did. Just slipped his collar one night and run off just before fall. So they went back home in town. It's better, Mother, Eddie told Nora. This bear is where she belongs. He belongs. But she was sorry over it. Well, the next April was uncommon warm, so they had their windows open. The missus slept out back in the big bed, but Eddie stayed up front to mind the goods. Not that you'd expect a thief that far in. By and by, he woke up in the dark, though, conscious of a great weight upon him. That's exactly the way he said it. A great weight upon him, which was just like Eddie, a great hand for putting a flower in when he spoke. That bear climbed in a window and got in his bed. And you didn't know, but he was ugly after almost a year living wild. Evan, Eddie told me, that was one of life's darkest moments. But after half an hour, the bear climbed right out again, and they never saw him afterwards. It was a good story, all right, likely half true anyhow. But it was really how Evan could spin it that tickled her. She bet her money that Sully could never tell it half so good. And him the one it happened to. Thing was, Evan had this gift to look like any animal he ever talked about. When he told about the little bull terrier he had as a kid, you almost saw the dog on nerves and quiver. If he showed you an eagle looking down from a limb, he really showed it. A treed cat, a swimming buck, Eddie's bear, all plain as pictures. He wasn't exactly imitating these things. He knew how to be them. Hard to explain. No, he never struck her. Didn't do so much as shout at her. Not even those times when she figured he almost had a right to. Mattie had a tug like a raven on her when she was a young woman. She'd admit it now, and truth is, she'd rear back and lace him now and again. It was like the drink took hold of him overnight and made him an old man. One day he's what she lived with all that time. Next he's not. He just got very quiet. In his 70s and playing out of things to say, it certainly weren't Evan Butcher. And he'd stay like that, hardly any talk at all for days. Or else he'd stay gone. Asleep in that rotten shop or driving the Twitch Road about 5 miles an hour, pining around the cemetery till he passed dead away. One night he'd freeze if he kept up that damn silliness or roll off a bank somewhere. Another cup of tea would stick her in the bathroom half the morning, but Mattie poured it. As good on the toilet as anywhere, only putting in time. The idea made her sad, but that weren't Mattie. No more than she could truly believe Evan was Evan these days. Now I'm going to cut out a page or two. Wherever they were, Evan paddled to work in the morning. It was guiding mostly because of summer. He'd be back at evening, and she couldn't wait to see him. Oh, she kept busy enough all day burying or getting wood or finding a little sprig of something for decoration. Evan always trailed a black ghost fly, so they ate some kind of fish for a lot for suppers. By the time the leaves changed, the loons were getting out of the lake. But Mattie had tamed down one old hen by feeding her fish scraps and guts. That bird was the last to fly to the coast. Feeding her and making of her would fill up a little chunk of daytime too. No, never a worry, but for maybe that foolish loon would forget ice was on the way. A few hairs grew out on Maddie's chin that summer. She tried to pluck them with her fingers, but there weren't a mirror anywhere, and she never could get all of them. She had her tweezers and looking glass these days, but she went back to letting the damn things grow out again. Evan never said a word about how she looked once he took to his new ways. Back then he spoke up all right, but not mean, only teasing about the scraggle on her face. It sure didn't slow him up much. She took to the bathroom, sat there, and suddenly tasted something. Tears. They surprised the daylights out of her. She called herself Batty right out loud and went back to the kitchen. By and by, she peeked out the shop-side window in spite of herself and saw what was left of her Evan, hair all anyhow on his head, blinking like an owl. Once Evan Butcher hewed 32 A-grade railroad sleepers in one day. His shirt was white as his teeth. He wrapped her up in his hard arms all night long, hairy chin and all, even in the belly of a canoe. Now look. Sorry, I hope I didn't go over too much.
Wow. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sydney and Tim both. That was great. You can order the books from the link in the chat, and it will support indie bookstores. So on October 18th through the 20th, over 40 authors will descend on downtown Brattleboro for the 23rd annual Brattleboro Literary Festival, including National Book Award winners Sigrid Nunez and M.T. Anderson, the president of the National Constitution Center, Jeffrey Rosen, Paul Newman's and Joanne Woodward's daughter, Melissa Newman, late night comedian Gary Gulman, and Frank Zappa's daughter, Moon Unit Zappa.
Wow.
Yeah. A few events will be live streamed and many will be recorded. The next literary cocktail hour will be November 8th with Laura Beers and her book Orwell's Ghost, a look at Orwell's political legacy and his writing. And so we will see you at the festival next month or at the next literary cocktail hour. Until then, be well, be safe, and on November 5th, do not forget to vote.
Thank you, Sid, and I'm sorry if I cut your. I should have timed your reading a little bit better than I did.
I'm the one that didn't time it well, Tim. It's great to talk to you as always, and thank you all for the opportunity. Take care.
Oh,
Take
thank
care.
you so much.